A good Erev Shabbos. A fair warning for you, this story did not actually take place. It is in fact straight up a fabrication, but it's still funny to think about. The two principal characters of the story are now in the next world, and you would hope they would appreciate the joke, at very least. Rabbi Sachs is about to be knighted by Her Majesty the Queen, and he's nervous. He's been prepared. He's memorized the special Latin phrase that he's supposed to recite when he receives his knighthood. So Her Majesty is working her way down the line of honorees, and she comes to the rabbi, and in the moment, he blanks. He cannot remember the Latin sentence that he's supposed to say. So in an instant, he does his best. He figures he'll wing it, hoping that no one is listening too carefully. As she dubs him Sir Jonathan Sachs, he intones reverentially, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. Of course, the queen does pay attention to these details, and she notices the difference. Puzzled, she turns to her equerry and asks, why is this night different than all the other nights? We're in a new era of history. The second Elizabethan era has concluded, and the third Carolean age is underway, and Chief Rabbi Mervis has been knighted as part of King Charles's first honors list back in December. You surely know that the Chief Rabbi was invited to take part in the coronation of the King and Queen last week, and if you read the papers, you surely know that the coronation was on Shabbos, which posed an interesting set of challenges. First of all, being on Shabbat, it would hardly do for the Chief Rabbi to be absent, or, on the other hand, to have to break Shabbos. That was easily enough accomplished by the king inviting him to stay over Shabbos in Clarence House. Their majesties are, as you know, empty nesters, and apparently they had a spare bedroom. And also, at the ceremony itself, at the coronation, there was no microphone present when the Chief Rabbi, together with other faith leaders, spoke to the king. Oh, and of course, kosher catering. It should be noted that President Herzog of Israel was also in attendance, and he also stayed by close in the neighborhood and walked rather than drove on Shabbat. Note that President Herzog went to religious day school, at least when his parents lived in New York. He went to the Ramaz school. So their day school education makes a difference. No, there's a slightly more subtle quandary even beyond the Shabbos issue. Jews are really not supposed to go into churches. The Mishnah writes about it. Rambam Maimonides decides that way in his Mishnah Torah. And his words are quoted in Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Many people who do interfaith dialogue say that there's nothing the press loves more than to snap a photo of some Jewish official seated on a panel with a nice big crucifix on the wall in the background. That's front page news for those of us who remember what a front page is. The halacha is that a Jew should absent themselves from church proceedings, with one notable exception. The exception is when the sovereign requests your presence. Then it's a different story. When the sovereign invites you, you go, no matter where it is. Accordingly, this following story seems to be factual. It seems as if it actually happened. And please forgive the use of the same characters again, but this one is fascinating for this conversation. The late Lord Sachs was, in fact, a good friend to many faith leaders in and out of the Jewish community. So, when the Cardinal Archbishop of London passed away some years ago, the organizers of his funeral called upon the Chief Rabbi to deliver a eulogy for his close friend. Rabbi Sachs politely declined, explaining that as an observant Jew, he was not allowed to enter the cathedral. They said, okay, can we get back to you? They called back later and said, we understand you can't speak, but your presence at the funeral would be a wonderful tribute to the late Archbishop. So would you please sit in the VIP front row seating at the funeral? Again, he explained that a Jew cannot enter a Catholic church. We'll call you back. This time they said, would you be able to participate by sitting in the Archbishop's office and watching the proceedings on closed-circuit television. This Rabbi Sachs agreed to. So the day arrived for the funeral mass for the late Archbishop, and before the service began, the priest in charge announced, I'm not going to do the accent, I won't embarrass myself, before we begin, we should like to acknowledge the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, who observes the proceedings from the Archbishop's office by closed-circuit television. Accompanying Her Majesty is Sir Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom. You see, the Queen also has halachas that she has to follow. As the head of the Church of England, she's also not allowed to enter a Catholic church. Can you imagine the Kiddush Club that they were having there in the Archbishop's office? Must have been worth skipping services for. We're going to learn about the mitzvah of appointing a king later in the summer when we read Parshas Shoftim, where Moshe Rabbeinu instructs us that when we come into the land of Israel, he says, Soim tasim alecha melech, asher yivchar Hashem elekecha boi mikerev achicha tasim alecha melech. You shall surely appoint over yourselves as a king whom Hashem will choose from amongst your brethren. Lo yisuchal lo seis alecha ish nochri asher lo achichahu. Do not appoint a foreigner because he is not of your family. When the Jewish people went into our land, we did in fact appoint kings. And that part of Jewish history, for those who have studied it, you'll know, is not always the most illustrious chapters of our history on all counts. There were kings whom we revere and whose words we still recall and read and study every day, looking at you, King David. And then there were kings from whom we learned a lot of what not to do. There was terrible corruption and tyranny, and we read some of these accounts as haftorahs in the course of the year to remind ourselves that there's no guaranteed solution to governance. Pirkei Avos, which we review every summer, reminds us to be loyal and upstanding citizens, but never to put all our eggs in one basket. Remember that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, compiled and edited the Mishnah around 19 centuries ago, collecting wisdom that had already been current for a few hundred years at least. The Mishnah's advice for today is perhaps even more relevant than it was then. It says, Havu zehirin berashus. It says, be cautious of the government. She'ein mekarevin lo la'adam el letzorech atzman. They only reach out to a person for their own purposes. Nirin ka'ohavin b'shas hana'asan. They seem friendly when it benefits them. Ve'ein lo omdin lo la'adam b'shas dachkoi. They cannot be counted upon to stand by a person in his hour of need. Okay, so even factoring in skepticism about temporal powers, still, kingship is a model or a paradigm that we use frequently in Jewish thought and prayer, and it's worth thinking about why that is. In the best possible scenario, a king is wise, benevolent, kind, forgiving, and uses his powers for the good of the people. If all his people are Jews, as in a Jewish king, in that case it's good for all the Jews. If he's a non-Jewish king, then he exercises power for the good and benefit of all the subjects in his realm, and that benefits the Jews as well. There's a lively and extensive discussion in yeshiva circles in Israel whether the government of the modern state of Israel has the same standing in Jewish law as a Jewish king in terms of privileges granted and responsibilities applied. Probably as much or more than any time in history, we have a sovereign of the UK now who looks kindly toward the Jewish people, is not only respectful, but genuinely interested in the welfare of the Jewish people as well as in our ideas. It's altogether fitting and proper that Chief Rabbi, now Sir Ephraim Mervis, KBE, was invited to and participated in the coronation last Shabbos. Thankfully, there was a shul near Westminster Abbey, so he could catch the early minyan on the way. And it's also fitting and proper that we should offer a prayer for the well-being of the new king and queen. A number of people have shared at the Kiddush their memories of royal visits to South Africa and Canada stretching back many decades. My own memories really only go back to 1981, to the royal wedding, for those who recall his first wife. And we can look again to Pirkei Avos for another important instruction about how to regard the sovereign. In Perek Gimel, Mishnah Beis, it says, Rabbi Chanina Sagan HaKohanim Omer Havei Mispalel B'Shloima Shel Malchus. Rabbi Chanina, who was the deputy high priest, used to say, pray for the welfare of the government. The term is actually the sovereign, Malchus, the Melech. Shel ilmale moira'a ish esre'ehu chayim beloy. If it weren't for the fear that the government instills, people would swallow each other alive. Well, we hope it's less the fear than the good example of moral and honest leadership with integrity and transparency that the government inspires us, more than the fear, but maybe we have a ways to go on that yet. But this instruction to pray for the welfare of the government has been around for at least a couple of thousand years, and in your bulletin we have, for fun, a few historical examples, together with the current prayer that's said in shuls in the UK. You'll see the wording has changed a little bit over the past 100 years, since the reigning king's great-grandfather was the first of the Windsor dynasty to occupy the throne, but it hasn't changed that much. The prophet Jeremiah calls on the Jewish people in Babylon to daven for the peace of the city where exile has taken them. And the famous Cairo Geniza contains a formal prayer for Al-Amir, the 10th caliph of the Shiite Fatimid dynasty, who reigned for 30 years beginning in 1101. Rabbi David Abudurraham, who compiled a lengthy siddur with commentary in the early 1300s in Seville, where he lived, mentions specifically that part of the Torah service should include a prayer for the sovereign. There seems to be evidence from Ashkenaz around this time as well, from the Kolbo Siddur among others. So we've been at this for some time. One example you have in your bulletin is from the late 1600s, from a Siddur manuscript, a prayer for Leopold Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia. The Noda B'Yehuda, Rav Yechezkel Landau, who was the Rav of Prague in the middle 1700s, writes that it's an obligation, a chovah, to daven for the well-being of the sovereign because they allow us to dwell in peace, and God forbid we be seen as ungrateful, since they are good to us. Thankfully, again, we live in an era where, at least for the moment, our rights are protected, our communities are relatively safe, and for the most part, our lives as Jews and citizens are relatively stable. We certainly ought to pay attention to Rav Landau's advice from almost 300 years ago, to feel appreciative and to express our appreciation to those who are responsible to keep order and peace in the land, so that we can live our lives without fear of being who we are. This week is a Shabbat of strength, Shabbos Chazak. So, as Chief Rabbi Mervis commented on the many people who wished him Shalom and Shabbat Shalom as he made his way on foot last Shabbos to the coronation, people respect us when we respect our traditions. The beginning of our second of two parshas this morning, Shabbos morning, Im Bechukosai Telechu, if you will walk in my ways, says God. May we all continue to have the strength to walk proudly in those ways and in safety and security and peace wherever we go. Shabbat Shalom.